The battlefield stretched endlessly under a blood-red sky, smoke rising from scorched earth where wolves had fought and fallen, their bodies scattered across the terrain like broken monuments to violence and desperation. The air itself seemed to pulse with residual aggression, thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of fear that clung to everything, seeping into the soil and poisoning the very ground where hundreds of warriors had clashed in brutal combat. This was the battle of the Shattered Borders, a conflict that would determine whether the unified wolf kingdom would survive or fracture into chaos once more. And every creature with sense had fled when the fighting erupted, running for safety while the warriors tore into each other with fang and claw. Every creature except one. Ilara Moonwhisper stood at the edge of the carnage, her silver hair whipping around her face in the hot wind that carried ash and desperation, her violet eyes taking in the scope of devastation with a mixture of horror and determination that most would find incomprehensible. She had been traveling through these borderlands as she always did, offering her healing services to poor villages that could never afford the official healers sanctioned by the nobility, carrying her worn leather satchel filled with herbs and bandages that seemed pitifully inadequate now as she surveyed the dozens of wolves crying out in agony. Common sense screamed at her to run, to preserve her own. Life as any rational being would do, but something deeper and more fundamental than survival instinct pulled at her chest, a compulsion she could not name but could not ignore. The same force that had driven her to heal even when she had nothing, even when her own pack had rejected her as worthless, even when the world had taught her that compassion was weakness. The sounds of the dying reached her ears, pleas for help in voices raw with pain, and Ilara felt her hands beginning to glow with that familiar silver light that she had never fully understood, the gift that marked her as different, dangerous, other. She took a step forward, then another, walking directly into the chaos while everyone else ran away. Before we continue with this incredible tale of courage and impossible love, if you are enjoying this story of the Omega healer who defied every expectation, please take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments what you think will happen when the ruthless Alpha King discovers this mysterious woman saving his warriors. And do not forget to subscribe, because we have so many more supernatural romance stories coming your way that will absolutely captivate you with their emotional intensity and unexpected twists. The first wolf Ilara reached was a young soldier, barely past his 20th year, his chest torn open by claws that had raked deep through muscle and scraped against bone, blood pumping out in rhythmic spurts that meant he had minutes at best before death claimed him. His eyes, glazed with shock and fading fast, flickered toward her as she dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving to press against the catastrophic wound, and she felt that familiar heat building in her palms, spreading up her arms like liquid silver running through her veins. The young wolf tried to speak, to warn her perhaps that she should not be here, but only blood bubbled from his lips, and Ilara shushed him gently, pouring her energy into his damaged body, watching with fierce concentration as the silver light intensified and began to knit torn tissue back together, coaxing his wolf healing to activate at an accelerated rate that should have been impossible. She had learned through years of desperate practice that her gift was not simply enhancing natural healing, but actually reversing damage, pulling bodies back from the very edge of death's domain, and though it exhausted her terribly, draining her own life force to fuel the process, she had never been able to turn away from suffering when she had the power to stop it. The young soldier gasped as his chest wound closed, the bleeding stopping as muscle and skin reformed, and his eyes cleared from the fog of approaching death, focusing on her face with wonder and confusion, as if she were some divine being descended from the moon itself. Rowan, she would later learn his name was. Just a boy, really. Fighting in a war he barely understood because his alpha commanded it, and he would never forget the silver-haired Omega who pulled him back from the abyss when he had already accepted his fate. Ilara left him there, knowing he would survive now, and moved to the next fallen wolf, then the next, her movements becoming mechanical as adrenaline and purpose overrode her fear, her hands glowing brighter with each healing, the silver light around her becoming a beacon in the smoke and darkness that was drawing attention from those still fighting. She did not discriminate, did not ask which side each wounded wolf fought for, did not care about allegiances or politics or the complex web of pack loyalty that had brought them all to this blood-soaked field. She saw only injured beings who needed help, and she gave it freely, exhausting herself further with each healing but unable to stop. Some of the wolves she reached were too far gone, their spirits already departing their torn bodies, and for these she could only close their eyes and whisper prayers to the moon goddess, feeling the weight of each failure like stones piling on her chest even as she moved to the next, who might yet be saved. The battle still raged around her in pockets of intense violence, warriors locked in combat barely noticing the small Omega woman moving through the carnage, and those who did notice were too shocked by the sight to process what they were seeing. This fragile-seeming creature walking fearlessly through a war zone to heal their fallen comrades. She stumbled over broken weapons and displaced earth, her dress torn and soaked with blood that was not her own, her face streaked with ash and tears. She did not remember crying, but still she continued, driven by that inexplicable compulsion that had defined her entire existence, the need to heal that was stronger than her need to survive. Across the battlefield, Kirin Shadowbane, the Alpha King himself, fought with the controlled fury that had made him legendary and feared throughout all wolf territories, his massive form moving with lethal grace as he cut through enemy combatants who sought to end his reign and shatter the unity he had built through years of brutal conquest and iron rule. At 32, he was in his absolute prime, his wolf enormous and terrifyingly powerful, his human form nearly 7 feet of pure muscle and dominance that radiated authority so strongly that lesser wolves could barely stand in his presence without their necks bowing in submission. His golden eyes, cold as winter sun, tracked every movement on the battlefield with tactical precision, calculating threats and eliminating them with efficient violence that wasted no motion, and his reputation as the ruthless was well earned, built on the bodies of those who had challenged his authority and lost everything. He had unified the fractured wolf packs through overwhelming force 5 years ago, bringing peace through fear and maintaining order through the certainty that rebellion would be crushed without mercy. And though his methods had created stability, they had also created resentment that festered in the borderlands where his control was weakest, and where these rebels had finally gathered enough courage to openly defy him. Kirin felt nothing as he fought. No joy in combat, no satisfaction in victory. Only the cold calculation of necessary violence to maintain the peace he had purchased with blood. His heart as frozen as it had been since the night 5 years ago when his Luna had died in his arms, her blood soaking into the earth while he howled his anguish to an indifferent moon. Celeste had been everything, his true mate and his anchor. And when she was taken from him in that ambush, something fundamental in Kirin had died with her, leaving only this cold, efficient killing machine that wore his face and ruled his kingdom with mechanical precision. It was Thorn Ironclaw, his beta and closest advisor, who first drew Kirin's attention to the impossible sight moving through the battlefield carnage, pointing with blood-splattered hand toward a figure that seemed to glow with silvery light, and Kirin's first instinct was to assume this was some new enemy tactic, perhaps a witch or dark healer sent to finish off his wounded warriors. He moved toward the figure with lethal intent, ready to eliminate this threat. But as he got closer, and his enhanced alpha vision pierced through the smoke and chaos, he saw something that made him pause, his killing strike hesitating in mid-motion, as comprehension slowly filtered through his combat-focused mind. The glowing figure was a woman, small and delicate compared to the massive warriors around her, her silver hair marking her as unusual, even among wolves. And she was not finishing off the wounded as he had assumed, but healing them, her hands pressed against catastrophic injuries that should have been fatal, silver light pouring from her palms into broken bodies that began to knit themselves back together in ways that defied everything Kirin understood about wolf healing. He watched, transfixed despite the battle still raging around him, as she moved from one of his fallen warriors to another, indiscriminately saving lives without regard for which side they fought on. And something about the sight stirred feelings in his chest that he had thought long dead, a sense of wonder and confusion that pierced through the ice that had encased his heart for 5 long years. Who was this woman? This fool who walked through a Warzone to heal strangers, and why did watching her make his chest ache with something that felt dangerously like hope? Kieran's moment of distraction nearly cost him everything, a rebel alpha seizing the opportunity to launch a desperate attack. But Thorn intercepted the strike, engaging the enemy and giving Kieran space to refocus, though his eyes kept drifting back to the silver-haired healer who seemed to shine like moonlight in the darkness of violence and death. The battle was turning in his favor, the rebel forces beginning to break and scatter as his superior numbers and training took their toll. But victory felt hollow as it always did. Just another necessary brutality in an endless series of necessary brutalities that maintained the peace his Luna had died for. He was preparing to give the order to pursue the fleeing rebels when he caught movement in his peripheral vision. A glint of metal that his instincts recognized as deadly. An arrow loosed from hiding, aimed directly at his exposed back, and he began to turn, but knew with sickening certainty that he would not be fast enough to avoid it. The arrow struck his shoulder with brutal force, punching through his armor and driving deep into muscle. And immediately Kieran felt the searing burn of poison spreading through his system. Recognized it as Wolfsbane concentrate, rare and expensive and absolutely lethal even to alphas of his power, his vision already starting to blur and darken as the toxin raced toward his heart. He dropped to one knee, then both, his massive form swaying as his strength drained away with terrifying speed. And he had just enough time to think that this was a stupid way to die. Brought down by a coward's poisoned arrow after surviving countless direct combats, before his vision narrowed to a tunnel and he felt himself falling forward into darkness. Alara saw the massive wolf shifter fall, recognized him instantly as the Alpha King himself, based on the sheer presence he radiated. Even in collapse, and she was running before conscious thought could intervene. Her exhausted legs carrying her across the blood-soaked ground toward the most powerful and dangerous wolf in all the territories. The male whose reputation for ruthless violence made him a figure of terror in every pack story and cautionary tale. Her healer instincts recognized the symptoms of Wolfsbane poisoning immediately, saw the black veins spreading from the arrow wound as the concentrated toxin attacked his system, and she knew with absolute certainty that he had minutes at most before the poison reached his heart and killed him regardless of his alpha strength. His beta and several elite guards formed a protective circle around their fallen king, weapons drawn and ready to kill anyone who approached. But Alara pushed through them, with a boldness born of pure, desperate purpose, ignoring their shouts and drawn blades to drop to her knees beside Kieran's massive prone form. His eyes, those legendary, golden eyes that could freeze lesser wolves with a glance, opened slightly and focused on her face with confusion and fading awareness. And Alara felt something jolt through her chest at that eye contact, something primal and profound that had nothing to do with the healing she was about to attempt. She did not have time to examine that feeling. Instead, ripping the arrow from his shoulder in one swift motion that made him grunt with pain, then pressing both hands over the wound and calling up every last reserve of power she possessed, feeling the silver light explode from her palms with an intensity that made several guards cry out and shield their eyes. The poison fought her, resisting her healing energy, trying to continue its deadly path through his system, and Alara gritted her teeth and poured more of herself into the effort, dimly aware that she was using more power than ever before, drawing on reserves she had not known existed, pulling the toxin out of his tissues and forcing it to leave his body through the open wound in a stream of black infected blood that hissed when it hit the ground. Kieran felt the excruciating pain of the poison being forcibly expelled from his system, every nerve ending screaming in agony. But beneath that pain was something else, a warmth that spread from where the strange woman's hands pressed against his shoulder, a comfort and safety that he had not felt since Celeste died, and his wolf, usually a barely controlled monster of violence and dominance, went utterly still and quiet. Recognizing something in this silver-haired healer that Kieran's human mind could not yet name, the darkness receded from his vision. The deadly paralysis released its grip on his muscles, and strength flowed back into his limbs as the healing energy reconstructed damaged tissue and purged the last traces of poison from his bloodstream, the process taking less than 2 minutes, but feeling like an eternity of sensation and impossible connection. When Elara finally pulled her hands away, swaying with exhaustion from the massive expenditure of power, the arrow wound had completely closed, leaving only smooth, unmarked skin where moments before there had been a fatal injury, and Kieran stared at his shoulder in disbelief before his gaze snapped back to the small woman kneeling beside him. This Omega who had just saved his life when he had already accepted death. He tried to speak, to demand her name, and how she had done this impossible thing. But his voice failed him, his usual cold command deserting him entirely as he looked into those violet eyes that seemed to see straight through all his armor and walls to the wounded male beneath. Instead of speaking, Kieran did something he had not done for anyone except his dead Luna. Something that made his beta and guards gasp in shock. He lowered his head in a gesture of deep respect and gratitude, the Alpha King himself acknowledging a debt to this unknown Omega healer who had stayed to help when everyone else had fled. Share your thoughts in the comments about what you think this moment of connection means for both Elara and Kieran. And if you are as captivated by their story as I am, make sure you have subscribed so you do not miss what happens next, when she is brought to the royal palace and faces the deadly politics of wolf nobility. The battle ended in the aftermath of Kieran's near death, the rebel forces scattering completely when word spread that their assassination attempt had failed, and the Alpha King still lived. But Kieran barely noticed the victory, his attention fixed entirely on the silver-haired healer, who had collapsed from exhaustion after saving his life. Her small form crumpled on the blood-soaked ground where she had knelt. He gathered her into his arms with uncharacteristic gentleness, noting how light she was, how fragile she seemed compared to the massive power she had wielded moments before, and something protective and possessive stirred in his chest that he immediately tried to suppress, telling himself it was merely gratitude and curiosity about her unprecedented healing abilities. Thorn organized the aftermath of battle, dealing with the wounded and captured rebels, while Kieran carried the unconscious healer to his command tent, laying her on his own cot and standing guard over her with an intensity that made his beta raise eyebrows, but wisely say nothing. She slept for hours, her breathing shallow but steady, and Kieran found himself unable to leave her side, studying her face in repose, noting the old scars on her hands that spoke of years practicing healing without proper training, the worn and patched quality of her dress that marked her as lower class, and the silver hair that marked her as bloodline unusual, possibly connected to ancient wolf lineages that most believed extinct. When her violet eyes finally fluttered open near dawn, finding his golden gaze immediately, Kieran felt that jolt of connection. Again, stronger this time. And his wolf stirred with interest that bordered on possessiveness, a reaction he had not experienced since meeting Celeste, and one that both intrigued and disturbed him deeply. Elara woke to find herself in an unfamiliar tent that smelled of leather and pine and something distinctly masculine and powerful, her healer senses identifying the scent as belonging to the massive alpha whose life she had saved. And when her eyes focused, she saw him sitting beside the cot, watching her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow was not. They stared at each other in silence for a long moment, communication happening below the level of words, a recognition passing between them that neither could name, but both felt with uncomfortable clarity, before Kieran finally spoke in a voice deeper and rougher than she had expected, asking her name and how she had learned to heal the way she did. Elara sat up slowly, her body aching from the massive power, expenditure, and introduced herself simply as Elara, a traveling healer, deliberately omitting her pack name because she had been cast out years ago and no longer had the right to claim it. And when Kieran pressed her about her training, she explained honestly that she had learned through necessity and practice, having been born with abilities she did not fully understand and had taught herself to control through trial and painful error. She expected him to dismiss her, perhaps offer payment for saving his life and send her on her way. But instead, Kieran made a pronouncement that changed everything, declaring that she would come to the royal palace at Silvercrest as his personal healer, that abilities like hers were too valuable to waste on wandering the borderlands, and that he would not accept refusal. Elara tried to protest, explaining that someone like her, a rejected Omega with no pack or status, would not be welcome among the nobility of his court, but Kieran's expression hardened into the ruthless mask that had earned his reputation, stating flatly that he was the Alpha King, and his word was law, and if he said she belonged at his palace, then that was where she would be, regardless of what anyone else thought about it. The journey to Silvercrest took 3 days, Ilara traveling in Kieran's personal carriage at his insistence while his warriors surrounded them as honor guard, and the other court members who had accompanied the king to battle whispered and speculated about this mysterious healer who had captured the Alpha King's attention so completely. Thorn rode beside the carriage and proved to be surprisingly kind, engaging Ilara in conversation about her healing techniques and sharing stories about the kingdom she was entering, gradually revealing his own concerns about how Kieran had changed over the past 5 years, becoming harder and colder, ruling through fear, rather than the balanced justice he had shown in the early years of his reign when his Luna, Celeste, had been alive to temper his harder edges. Ilara listened carefully, beginning to understand that the male who had knelt before her in gratitude on the battlefield was far more complex than his reputation suggested. A leader who had frozen his own heart to maintain peace, who carried guilt and grief, that he had transformed into cold efficiency. And she found herself wondering if her healing abilities might extend beyond physical wounds to the emotional and spiritual damage she sensed in this powerful, broken alpha. The palace of Silvercrest rose from the landscape like a mountain of white stone and silver spires, beautiful and imposing in equal measure, representing centuries of wolf sovereignty and power. And as they passed through the massive gates, Ilara felt simultaneously awed by its grandeur and intimidated by the hostile stares of the nobles and servants who stopped to watch the Alpha King return with this unknown Omega at his side. Kieran installed Ilara in guest quarters that were far more luxurious than anything she had ever experienced. Rooms decorated with silk and fine furniture that felt alien and uncomfortable to someone who had spent years sleeping in forest clearings and barn lofts. But he seemed to take satisfaction in her wide-eyed wonder at the accommodations, a small smile briefly softening his usually harsh features, before the mask of cold authority slammed back into place. He informed her that she would be presented at court the following day and officially granted the position of Chief Royal Healer, a title that had been vacant since the death of the previous holder decades ago, and when Ilara tried again to protest that she was unqualified for such an honor, Kieran leaned close, his presence overwhelming and his golden eyes boring into hers, stating that he had seen what she could do, had felt her power save him from certain death, and that she would accept this position and the authority that came with it, because he commanded it and because she had already proven she was the most skilled healer in his kingdom. The intensity in his voice suggested this was about more than just her healing abilities, that something deeper was driving his insistence on keeping her close, and Ilara felt her breath catch at the proximity and the heat in his gaze, before he abruptly pulled back and left her alone to rest and prepare for the political storm that was about to break over her head. The presentation at court the next day was exactly the disaster Ilara had feared. The throne room packed with noble wolves who radiated disapproval and barely concealed contempt, as Kieran formally announced that this unknown Omega would hold one of the highest positions in the palace, answering only to him and given authority over all matters related to healing and medicine throughout the kingdom. The whispers started immediately. Vicious speculation about what she had done to bewitch their king, suggestions that she had used dark magic or seduction to manipulate him, and several high-ranking nobles openly questioned the wisdom of giving such power to someone with no credentials, no pack, no verification of her claims beyond the Alpha King's word. Ilara stood straight, despite the hostility washing over her, her chin raised in defiance even as her heart pounded with fear, refusing to show weakness to these wolves who saw her as beneath them, as an aberration that threatened the established order they benefited from. But it was Ladia. Morgana Nightshade, the king's chief advisor and a stunning she-wolf with midnight black hair and cunning dark eyes, who struck the most dangerous blow, sweetly questioning whether it was appropriate for the king to show such favor to any female so soon, reminding everyone present with false sympathy that it had been only 5 years since their beloved Luna Celeste had died, suggesting that perhaps grief had clouded the Alpha King's judgment. The throne room went deathly silent at this calculated strike, everyone waiting to see how Kieran would respond to having his dead mate invoked to question his current decision. And Ilara watched as his entire body went rigid, his hands gripping the arms of his throne with enough force to crack the stone, his golden eyes turning utterly cold as he stared at Morgana with an expression that promised death for her impertinence. When Kieran finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the throne room like winter wind, freezing everyone who heard it, and he stated with absolute finality that his grief for Luna Celeste had nothing to do with recognizing exceptional talent when he saw it, that Alara had saved his life and the lives of dozens of his warriors using abilities that exceeded anything their current healers possessed, and that anyone who questioned his judgment on this matter was welcome to challenge him directly and face the consequences of such challenge. The threat was unmistakable, the reminder that Kieran had unified the kingdom through personal combat and remained undefeated, that questioning his authority was essentially requesting a death sentence, and the nobles immediately lowered their eyes in submission, even as their resentment burned hotter beneath the surface. Morgana smiled and bowed her head in seeming acceptance, but Alara saw the flash of hatred in those dark eyes, recognized that she had just made a powerful and dangerous enemy, someone who saw her as a threat to carefully laid plans that Alara could not yet perceive, but sensed were deadly. The ceremony concluded with Alara formally accepting the position and swearing an oath of service to the crown, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil, and when it was done, Kieran rose from his throne and offered her his arm to escort her from the throne room, a gesture of honor typically reserved for Luna or high nobility, making a statement to everyone watching that she was under his personal protection, and any move against her would be considered a move against him directly. In the days and weeks that followed, Alara struggled to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics while also fulfilling her duties as chief royal healer, establishing a healing ward in the palace, and immediately implementing changes that horrified the noble healers who had previously held power in that domain. She insisted on treating everyone regardless of rank or status, opening the healing ward to servants and common soldiers as readily as nobles, arguing that suffering did not respect social hierarchy, and neither should healing. And this revolutionary approach won her loyalty from the lower classes, while earning her even more enmity from the nobility who saw their privileged access being diluted. Kieran supported her decisions absolutely, backing her authority with his own, and making it clear that any healer who refused to follow her directives would be dismissed immediately, but even his support could not completely shield her from the subtle sabotage and constant undermining she faced from those who wanted her to fail and leave the palace in disgrace. She worked exhausting hours, healing dozens of patients daily and pushing her abilities to their limits, driven by the same compulsion that had sent her onto the battlefield, unable to turn away from suffering even when it drained her to the point of collapse. And more than once, Kieran found her passed out in the healing ward after treating patients for 16 hours straight, carrying her back to her quarters himself and staying until she woke, berating her for not taking care of herself with an intensity that suggested his concern went far deeper than that of a king for a valued servant. The tension between them grew with each interaction, an attraction that neither could fully acknowledge or act upon, weighted down by grief and guilt, and the vast social chasm between a ruthless Alpha King and a rejected Omega healer. But everyone in the palace could feel it crackling in the air whenever they were in the same room, a connection that defied logic and propriety, and all the rules that governed their world. Kieran found excuses to visit the healing ward far more often than necessary, watching Alara work with an intensity that made his guards uncomfortable, seeing how gentle she was with even the lowest servant, how she treated everyone with the same compassion and respect, regardless of their position, and it reminded him painfully of Celeste, who had also believed in the inherent worth of all wolves, and had been working to implement reforms that would have challenged the rigid hierarchy before her death had ended those dreams. But Alara was not Celeste, her compassion born not from noble idealism, but from personal experience with rejection and suffering, her strength forged through necessity rather than privilege, and Kieran found himself drawn to that resilient core of integrity that suffering had not broken but only made stronger. They began meeting in the palace gardens late at night, when neither could sleep. Conversations starting awkwardly, but gradually deepening as they revealed pieces of themselves to each other. Kieran speaking of Celeste for the first time since her death, the guilt he carried that his insistence on her accompanying him on that fatal journey had put her in danger, and Alara sharing her own story of being cast out by her pack after her parents died under mysterious circumstances, blamed for their deaths because of her strange abilities that no one could explain or understand. It was during one of these midnight conversations that Alara first experienced the visions that would eventually unravel everything, touching a stone bench where Kieran said Celeste used to sit, and suddenly being overwhelmed by images that were not her own memories, fragments of a night 5 years ago, seeing through someone else's eyes as a beautiful blonde. She wolf laughed and spoke about plans for reform, seeing shadows moving where they should not be, feeling malicious intent, focused like a weapon. Alara gasped and pulled her hand away from the stone, the vision breaking abruptly, leaving her shaking and confused. And when Kieran demanded to know what was wrong, she tried to explain what she had seen, but could not make sense of it herself, did not understand how she could possibly be experiencing memories that did not belong to her, visions of events she had not witnessed. Kieran went, very still at her description, his face shuddering closed, and he abruptly left the garden without another word, leaving Alara alone and uncertain whether she had offended him by invoking his dead mate, or whether something else entirely had driven him away. She did not see him for 3 days after that, their nightly meetings abandoned, and she felt his absence like a physical ache that terrified her, because it meant she had developed feelings far beyond professional respect for this cold, powerful male, who sometimes showed her glimpses of the passionate, caring leader he had been before grief froze him solid. Everything changed the night of the formal dinner to celebrate the anniversary of the kingdom's unification, a massive event that every noble family attended in their finest clothing, a display of wealth and power that made Alara deeply uncomfortable in the elaborate dress Kieran had insisted she wear, silk and jewels that felt like costume on someone who had spent years in practical traveling clothes. She sat at the high table, at Kieran's insistence, placed in a position of honor that made the noble she-wolves glare with jealous hatred, particularly Lady Morgana, who watched Alara throughout the meal with an expression of calculation that made the healer's instincts scream warnings. The food was elaborate, course after course of delicacies that Alara barely tasted, too aware of the social currents swirling around her and the way Kieran kept glancing at her. Throughout the meal, as if checking that she was still there, still real, still looking at him with those violet eyes that seemed to see past all his defenses. It was during the 7th course, a rich soup flavored with exotic spices, that Alara felt the first symptoms, a burning in her throat that spread rapidly through her chest, her vision blurring at the edges, and her heartbeat becoming erratic and too fast. She recognized the signs of poisoning immediately, her healer training kicking in, even as panic threatened to overwhelm rational thought, and she tried to stand, to call for help, but her legs would not support her, and she collapsed forward, her head cracking against the table hard enough to make stars explode across her darkening vision. The throne room erupted into chaos, nobles shouting and guards rushing forward. But Kieran moved faster than thought, catching Alara before she could slide from her chair to the floor. His roar of fury so primal and powerful that every wolf in the room instinctively cowered, their bodies responding to the rage of an alpha king who saw someone under his protection harmed. He lifted her into his arms, her body already convulsing from the poison racing through her system, and he ran from the throne room with a speed that was barely human, his wolf form threatening to break through as instinct overrode control, taking her not to the healing ward, but to his own private chambers, the rooms he had not allowed anyone to enter since Celeste died. He laid Alara on his bed, shouting for Thorn to bring every healer in the palace immediately, and then he did something that shocked his beta into momentary stillness. Kieran pushed up his sleeve and sliced his own wrist open with a claw, forcing the wound to Alara's lips and commanding her to drink, giving her his alpha blood in a desperate attempt to help her system fight the poison. Alpha blood was powerful medicine, capable of enhancing healing and fighting toxins, but it was also deeply personal, creating bonds between giver and receiver. And for Kieran to offer it so freely spoke of the depth of his panic and his unwillingness to lose this woman, who had somehow become essential to him in just a few short weeks. Alara's throat worked reflexively, swallowing the blood even in her poisoned stupor, and Kieran felt the moment it entered her system, felt the connection between them strengthen and solidify in a way that would have terrified him if he had been thinking clearly, instead of being consumed by desperate fear. The healers arrived and identified the poison as nightshade extract. Ironic and probably deliberate given Lady Morgana's name. A slow-acting toxin that would have killed Alara within hours if not treated. And they worked frantically to purge it from her system while Kieran stood over them like a statue of violence barely restrained. His presence so intimidating that the healers' hands shook as they worked. It took until dawn, Alara's body fighting the Yai. Poison with enhanced vigor thanks to the alpha blood strengthening her system. And when she finally stabilized and slipped from toxic delirium into healing sleep, Kieran dismissed everyone from his chambers and sat beside the bed, taking her scarred hand in his much larger one, and simply holding it, feeling her pulse beat steady and strong under his fingers. He stayed there all day, and through the next night, leaving her side only once to deal with the investigation into who had poisoned her. His cold fury making even his most loyal guards nervous as he ordered every servant who had handled food that night to be questioned, every noble who had access to the kitchens to be investigated, making it absolutely clear that whoever had dared to harm Alara would face his personal wrath in ways that would make death seem merciful. The investigation concluded that rebels had infiltrated the palace and poisoned her, several suspicious servants arrested and executed for treason, but Alara, stirring from sleep and seeing Kieran's exhausted face beside her, his golden eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness but locked on her with desperate intensity, knew with absolute certainty that the investigation was wrong, that the threat had come from inside the palace proper, from someone with far more access and power than mere servants, though she could not yet prove it, and had no idea why someone would want her specifically dead. When Alara was strong enough to speak, she tried to thank Kieran for saving her life, for giving her his blood, but he cut her off with a growl, stating roughly that she had saved his life first, and this merely made them even. Though the way he still held her hand and refused to move more than a few feet from her side suggested his feelings on the matter went far deeper than simple reciprocity. She asked him why he had brought her to his chambers instead of the healing ward, and the question made him stiffen, made him aware that he had brought her into rooms he had preserved as a shrine to his dead mate, rooms that still contained Celeste's belongings and her scent, rooms he had sworn no one else would ever occupy. He had no good answer, no rational explanation for why instinct had driven him to bring Alara to his most private space, to his own bed, to surround her with his scent and keep her close where he could protect her. And the lack of explanation was itself revealing, suggesting that the connection between them had grown far beyond what either had acknowledged or intended. Alara saw the conflict in his face, the guilt warring with something that looked dangerously like longing, and she made a decision that was either brave or foolish, reaching up with her free hand to touch his face gently, telling him softly that honoring the dead did not require him to stop living, that she did not think his Celeste would have wanted him to freeze his heart forever, in tribute to her memory. Kieran pulled away from her touch as if burned, standing abruptly and leaving the room without a word, and Alara was left alone in his chambers, wondering if she had just destroyed whatever fragile connection they had built, or whether her words had simply struck too close to truths he was not ready to face. If you are as invested in Kieran and Alara's complicated relationship as I am, please like this video and share your theories in the comments about who really poisoned Alara, and what you think Kieran will do when he finally confronts his feelings. And make sure to subscribe because the story is about to take some shocking turns that will change everything they thought they knew. 3 days after the poisoning, Alara was back on her feet and returning to her duties in the healing ward, despite Kieran's commands that she rest longer. Her stubborn determination to help others overriding both medical advice and royal authority, though she noticed with some amusement that he assigned 2 elite guards to follow her everywhere, ostensibly for protection, but really because he could not stop himself from trying to keep her safe. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, partly because she genuinely cared about her patients, and partly because staying busy kept her from thinking too much about Kieran, and the way his scent had surrounded her in his chambers, the way she had felt inexplicably safe and right in his space, despite the circumstances. It was during a quiet afternoon, treating a young servant girl for a broken arm, that an ancient male wolf entered the healing ward, his white fur and deeply lined face marking him as elder, his pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence that age had not dimmed. He introduced himself as Elder Sage Fenwick, a healer who had served the palace decades ago before retiring to private life, and he asked if he might speak with Alara privately about matters of some delicacy and importance. Curious and slightly wary, Alara led him to a private treatment room. And what? He told her there shook the foundations of everything she thought she knew about herself and her abilities. Fenwick explained that he had recognized her the moment he saw her healing on the battlefield, recognized the silver glow of her power and the way she could pull wolves back from death itself, because he had seen such abilities before many years ago in a mated pair of healers who had served the palace briefly before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. And those healers had been the last known surviving members of an ancient bloodline called lunar healers, beings who were blessed or cursed depending on perspective with healing abilities that transcended normal limits, who could not only cure disease and mend wounds, but also see truths hidden in the psychic residue left on objects and places, who could in extreme cases even resurrect the recently dead by calling their spirits back from the threshold of the moon goddess's realm. Alara listened to this explanation with growing shock, pieces of her life suddenly clicking into place, understanding finally why her pack had feared her strange abilities, why they had blamed her when her parents died, even though she had been just a child, why she had always felt different and other in ways that went beyond her Omega status. Fenwick confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that her parents had been those lunar healers, that they had gone into hiding because their bloodline had been systematically hunted too. Extinction a century ago, when the ruling wolves decided that beings with such power were too dangerous to allow to exist, capable of disrupting carefully constructed hierarchies and challenging authority by healing those who were meant to die, by seeing truths that were meant to stay hidden. The old healer explained that her parents had likely been discovered and eliminated by those who feared what lunar healers represented, that her childhood pack had cast her out partially from superstitious fear and partially because keeping her would have made them targets as well, and that her ability to see visions when touching objects was her psychic gift awakening, responding to the intense emotions and events surrounding her recent poisoning and her growing connection to the Alpha King. Fenwick taught her techniques to control and focus her visions, explaining that she could use this ability to see the truth of past events, to read the emotional and psychic impressions left behind by strong feelings and significant moments. And he warned her gravely that this gift would likely draw danger to her, because there were those in positions of power who had secrets they would kill to protect, truths that a lunar healer's visions could expose. When Alara asked why he was telling her all this, taking such a risk to reveal himself as someone who knew about lunar healers and their fate, Fenwick smiled sadly and explained that he had loved her mother like a sister, had watched helplessly as she and her mate were hunted down, and he would not stand by and watch their daughter face the same fate without at least giving her knowledge and tools to protect herself with. Armed with this new understanding of her abilities, Alara began to deliberately test her visions, touching objects around the palace and opening herself to the impressions they contained, seeing fragments of the building's long history, centuries of joy and sorrow and intrigue played out in emotional echoes that clung to stone and wood and metal. She was careful to do this secretly, aware that revealing this particular gift would make her even more of a target than she already was. But she could not resist the pull to understand, to use this ability to uncover truths that normal investigation could never reach. It was inevitable that her searching visions would eventually lead her to seek the truth about Celeste's death, partly because she sensed that Kieran's grief and guilt over that event was the key to understanding the male he had become, and partly because her healer instincts sensed that something about the official story did not add up, that there were wounds beneath the surface that had never properly healed. She waited until late one night when the palace was quiet, then made her way to the royal chambers where Celeste's belongings were still kept, using her authority as chief royal healer to bypass the guards who would have stopped anyone else. And she stood in those preserved rooms, surrounded by the ghostly presence of the dead Luna, the female who had held Kieran's heart first, and perhaps still held it even from beyond death. With trembling hands, Alara reached out and touched the ornate crown that Celeste had worn, the one she had been wearing the night she died, and she opened herself completely to whatever visions it contained, bracing for the emotional impact of witnessing a murder through psychic impression. The visions hit her with overwhelming force. Centuries of tradition and ceremony contained in the crown but overshadowed by the intense emotions of that fatal night 5 years ago. And suddenly Alara was seeing through Celeste's eyes, experiencing her final hours with vivid clarity that felt more real than memory. She saw Celeste preparing for a journey with Kirin, excited and nervous because she planned to use this trip to convince him to support the reforms she had been planning. Changes that would redistribute power and resources, that would give voice to Omegas and lower-ranking wolves, that would challenge the rigid hierarchy that benefited the nobility at the expense of everyone else. She felt Celeste's love for Kirin, pure and deep and absolute, her certainty that she could help him become the just and compassionate leader she knew he was capable of being. Then the journey itself, riding through forest paths, and the moment when everything went wrong, when wolves emerged from hiding not as random bandits, but as orchestrated attackers, and Celeste, recognizing in that frozen moment of horror that this was not chance but betrayal, that someone had known their route and planned this ambush, that someone wanted her specifically dead. Alara felt Celeste's desperate fight, felt her die in Kirin's arms knowing that her death would break him, would turn him into something cold and ruthless, would end all hope of the reforms she had dreamed of implementing. And in those final fading moments, Celeste's last coherent thought had been sorrow not for her own death, but for what it would do to the male she loved and the kingdom she had hoped to help heal. The vision released Alara abruptly, leaving her gasping and crying on the floor of Celeste's chambers, overwhelmed by the intensity of experiencing someone else's death. But beneath the grief was burning certainty that this had been assassination, not accident, that someone had deliberately removed Celeste because her reforms threatened their power, and that they had succeeded in turning Kirin into exactly the kind of ruthless authoritarian ruler who would maintain the status quo through fear, rather than justice. Alara knew she had to find proof, had to identify who had been behind the assassination, because this truth was the key to healing Kirin's deepest wounds, to freeing him from the guilt that had poisoned his spirit as surely as any toxin. She began investigating carefully, using her position to access palace records and question longtime servants, looking for any evidence of who might have benefited from Celeste's death, who had opposed her reforms most vociferously, who had the power and connections to arrange an ambush and keep it secret for 5 years. The answer, when she finally pieced it together from fragments of overheard conversations and suspicious patterns in old documents, was as shocking as it was obvious. Lady Morgana Nightshade, the king's most trusted advisor, the woman who had consolidated power in the vacuum left by Celeste's death, who had guided Kirin toward increasingly harsh policies that maintained traditional power structures, who stood to lose everything if Alara's influence pushed Kirin toward the reforms his first mate had died trying to implement. Alara knew confronting Morgana directly would be suicidal without concrete proof, but she needed to confirm her suspicions before going to Kirin with accusations that would sound like jealous paranoia from the Omega healer, who everyone assumed was trying to replace the beloved dead Luna. She decided to arrange a private meeting with Morgana, under the pretense of seeking advice about palace politics, gambling that the noble she-wolf's arrogance would make her overconfident enough to reveal something useful. The meeting took place in Morgana's lavish private chambers, decorated with dark elegance that matched her sophisticated cruelty, and the two females circled each other verbally like wolves preparing to fight, Morgana's false politeness, barely concealing her contempt for Alara, while Alara struggled to maintain composure, knowing she was in the presence of a murderer who had already tried to poison her once. Alara steered the conversation toward Celeste carefully, mentioning how everyone said the palace had been different when the Luna was alive, more open and hopeful. And Morgana's expression flickered with something dark before she composed herself and agreed smoothly that Celeste had been wonderful, if perhaps too idealistic, for the harsh realities of ruling wolves. When Alara suggested that perhaps some of Celeste's reforms should be revisited now that the kingdom was stable, Morgana's mask slipped completely, her face twisting with rage as she snarled that those reforms would have destroyed everything the nobility had built, would have elevated the weak and worthless at the expense of those who were born to lead, and she would not allow anyone, especially not some jumped-up Omega healer, to undo everything she had sacrificed to preserve. The confession came pouring out in Morgana's fury, her arrogance and certainty of her own superiority making her reckless, explaining that she had arranged Celeste's death with help from like-minded nobles, that they had used the grief to manipulate Kieran into becoming their perfect enforcer, maintaining order through brutality while they consolidated power behind his authority, that the poisoning of Ilara had been Morgana's personal work, because she recognized that Ilara represented the same threat Celeste had, a compassionate influence who might remind Kieran of the male he used to be before grief broke him. Morgana laughed at Ilara's shock, asked mockingly what the little Omega thought she would do with this information, reminded her that she had no proof, and no one would believe accusations from a low-born healer against the kingdom's most respected noble advisor. And then Morgana's expression turned deadly as she revealed her final card. She had been planning to eliminate Ilara anyway, but this confrontation made it urgent, and the guards who had escorted Ilara to these chambers were Morgana's personal wolves, loyal to her rather than the crown, ready to ensure that Ilara never left these rooms alive. Ilara realized her mistake too late, understood that her need for confirmation had made her reckless, and when Morgana's guards seized her, dragging her toward a hidden door that led to private dungeons beneath the palace that even Kieran did not know existed, she struggled desperately but uselessly against their superior strength, her healing abilities useless as a weapon. Her slim Omega body, no match for trained warriors who had orders to make her disappear without trace. The dungeon Morgana threw her into was specially constructed, the walls carved with runes that Fenwick had taught her to recognize as power dampeners, ancient symbols that would block her lunar healer abilities and prevent her from healing herself or using her psychic gifts to call for help, leaving her as helpless as any normal wolf awaiting execution. Morgana visited her in that cell, gloating about her plans, explaining that Ilara's disappearance would be blamed on rebels or rogue wolves, that Kieran would increase his authoritarian measures in response, driving the kingdom further toward the police state that Morgana and her co-conspirators preferred, because it kept the lower classes controlled and the nobility secure in their power. She revealed that the next phase of her plan involved orchestrating another war, even larger than the one where Kieran and Ilara had met, creating enough chaos and fear that Kieran would grant her emergency powers that would effectively make her co-ruler, and once she had that authority, she would quietly arrange for the Alpha King himself to have an unfortunate accident, leaving her free to install a puppet on the throne and rule through them without the complication of Kieran's occasional inconvenient conscience. Morgana admitted almost admiringly that Ilara had been the first real threat to these plans, that her healing abilities and influence over Kieran could have undone years of careful manipulation. But like Celeste before her, Ilara would die and become just another ghost haunting the Alpha King, another weight of guilt and grief that would push him further into isolation and brutality, making him easier to control or eventually dispose of. Then Morgana left, promising to return within a day to personally end Ilara's life, wanting to savor the moment of eliminating the last obstacle to her complete domination of the kingdom. Alone in the darkness of that cell, Ilara tested the limits of the dampening runes and found them horrifyingly effective, her healing light barely flickering before being suppressed, her psychic senses completely blocked, leaving her with nothing but her own thoughts and the certain knowledge that she was going to die having failed to expose the truth or warn Kieran about the betrayer in his inner circle. She thought about him, about the male who had knelt before her on a battlefield, who had given her his blood to save her life, who looked at her sometimes like she was something precious and terrifying. And she sent a desperate, wordless prayer to the moon goddess that somehow he would discover the truth, even if she was not alive to tell him. That Morgana's plans would fail, that the kingdom would survive, and Kieran would find a way to heal from the accumulated grief and manipulation that had shaped him into someone he was never meant to be. Time became meaningless in the darkness. Hours or perhaps a full day passing with no way to track the progression, her body weakening from lack of food and water and the energy drain of fighting against the dampening runes, and she had almost resigned herself to her approaching death when she heard sounds in the corridor outside her cell, the clash of weapons and snarls of fighting wolves. Then a massive impact against the cell door that made the stone shudder, followed by another and another, until the reinforced door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and torn metal. And Kieran stood in the doorway, his eyes blazing gold with alpha fury, his body still partially shifted and radiating such power and rage that the air itself seemed to tremble. And behind him was Thorn, and a squad of elite guards who looked equally ready to tear the palace apart stone by stone. Kieran crossed the cell in 2 strides, gathering Alara into his arms with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence still singing through his frame, his hands shaking as he checked her for injuries, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion as he took in her weakened state, and the dampening runes carved into every surface of her prison, understanding immediately what Morgana had done, and how close he had come to losing Alara forever. He asked in a voice rough with suppressed feeling how he had known she was in danger, how he had found her in a dungeon whose existence even he had been unaware of, and he explained that he had felt her distress through a connection he had not understood until it was threatened, a bond that had formed when she healed him and strengthened when he gave her his blood. Not quite a mate bond, but something similar, a resonance between their wolves that had let him sense when she was in mortal peril, pulling him unerringly toward her location even through stone. And concealment spells. Thorn reported that they had captured Morgana attempting to flee the palace with several co-conspirators once she realized her hidden dungeons had been discovered. That evidence of the conspiracy was being gathered even now, and that word had been sent to arrest all nobles suspected of involvement in the plot. Kieran's expression when Thorn mentioned Morgana's capture was terrifying. Pure predatory satisfaction mixed with rage so deep it seemed to turn his eyes into molten gold, and he promised Alara in a voice that made her shiver, despite her trust in him that Morgana would face justice for every crime she had committed, for Celeste's murder, and Alara's kidnapping, and the years of manipulation that had nearly destroyed everything good in him, and that justice would be public and absolute, and serve as warning to any who thought to threaten those under his protection again. The public trial of Lady Morgana Nightshade and her co-conspirators became the most significant event in the kingdom's history, nobles and commoners alike packing the throne room to capacity, while thousands more gathered in the courtyards and streets outside to hear the proceedings through speakers Kieran ordered installed, so that all could witness the truth being revealed. Morgana stood in chains before the throne, her proud beauty marred by fury and hatred as the evidence was presented methodically. Testimonies from servants and guards who had witnessed suspicious activities, financial records showing payments to the wolves who had ambushed Celeste, confessions extracted from the weaker co-conspirators who had broken under interrogation and revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had shaped 5 years of kingdom policy. The revelation of Celeste's assassination sent shockwaves through the crowd, many nobles and commoners openly weeping to hear that their beloved Luna had been murdered, not by random tragedy, but by deliberate betrayal from within the palace itself. And when Kieran took the stand to testify, his voice was steady, but his golden eyes betrayed the depth of his pain as he admitted how Morgana had used his grief as a weapon, how she had manipulated his guilt and rage into the authoritarian policies that had made him feared rather than respected, how he had allowed himself to be turned into a tool of oppression because he was too broken to see clearly what was being done in his name. The throne room was utterly silent as their Alpha King laid bare his own failure and manipulation, the kind of vulnerability and honesty that most rulers would never show their subjects. And it was in that moment that many wolves realized the male they had feared was also a victim, someone who had been shaped by trauma and treachery into someone he had never meant to become. When Alara took the stand, testifying about her visions of Celeste's final moments and describing how Morgana had confessed to everything, the conspirators' arrogance and belief in her own superiority overcome caution, the crowd's anger shifted from shock to fury, calls for immediate execution rising from the assembled wolves. But Kieran raised his hand for silence, explaining that Morgana and her co-conspirators would indeed face death for their crimes of murder, treason, and conspiracy against the crown, but their execution would be delayed briefly, not out of mercy, but to allow time for thorough investigation of everyone involved, ensuring that every thread of the conspiracy was exposed and cut before any executions were carried out, preventing any hidden allies from continuing the work after the leaders were dead. Morgana laughed bitterly at this. mocking Kieran's caution and predicting that his moment of weakness in showing vulnerability would be his downfall, that other nobles even now were planning to take advantage of his exposed emotional state, that his kingdom would tear itself apart without the fear and ruthless authority she had helped him cultivate. Her words, meant to wound and destabilize, instead had the opposite effect, Kieran's expression hardening into something that was neither the cold, ruthless mask he had worn for years, nor the vulnerable male of moments before, but something new, a mature integration of strength and compassion that made him somehow more intimidating than simple brutality ever had. And when he spoke, his voice carried through the throne room with absolute authority, as he declared that ruling through fear had never been strength but weakness, that true power came from justice, tempered with wisdom and authority, earned through service rather than extracted through terror, and that Morgana's greatest failure was not in being caught, but in fundamentally misunderstanding what kind of leader he intended to be moving forward. Morgana's forces made their move that night, loyalists who had not been caught in the initial arrests, launching a desperate assault on the palace in an attempt to free their imprisoned leaders and seize power through military coup, gambling that the chaos of the trial and exposure would have weakened Kieran's support enough that a show of force could topple his reign. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinated and brutal, catching the palace guards partially unprepared despite heightened security. And within minutes, the pristine halls were running with blood as defenders fought infiltrators in desperate close-quarters combat. Alara was in the healing ward when the attack began, immediately mobilizing every healer to prepare for mass casualties, transforming the ward into an emergency triage center while guards secured the perimeter to protect the vulnerable healers and patients from the violence exploding throughout the palace. She worked with focused intensity, her silver healing light flaring constantly as she moved between critically wounded defenders, keeping them alive until they could receive more comprehensive treatment. Her training and instinct overriding her fear, as she had done on that first battlefield where everything had begun. The ward filled rapidly with injured wolves from both sides, defenders and attackers alike, and Alara treated them all without distinction as she always did, her hands moving efficiently to stop bleeding and stabilize wounds, even on those who had moments before been trying to kill her king. Because healing was what she did, and she would not betray that calling no matter the circumstances. Kieran fought at the front of his forces, his massive alpha form tearing through attackers with brutal efficiency. But unlike his previous battles, there was no cold detachment, no mechanical violence. Instead, there was purpose, and even a kind of righteous anger that energized rather than froze him. Thorn fought at his back as always, the beta and alpha moving in perfect synchronization built from years of combat together, carving a path through the attackers toward the ward, where Kieran could sense through their bond that Alara was in danger as the fighting drew closer to the healing center. A group of conspirators had broken through the ward's defenses, determined to kill Alara and as many healers as possible, knowing that destroying the medical support would demoralize the defenders and make the coup more likely to succeed. And they burst into the main treatment room with weapons drawn, death in their eyes as they focused on the silver-haired healer who had exposed their conspiracy. Alara barely had time to register the threat before Kieran exploded into the room, his rage at finding Alara threatened overriding any tactical consideration, his claws and teeth tearing into the attackers with a savagery that sent blood spraying across the walls, and made even the other defenders pause in shocked recognition of just how much the Alpha King valued his healer. The fight was over in seconds, Kieran standing in the center of the carnage, breathing hard, his golden eyes finding Alara, and holding her gaze with such intensity that the rest of the world seemed to fade into irrelevance. And in that moment, both of them knew with absolute certainty that what had been building between them for months had crossed into territory far beyond gratitude or attraction, into something profound and permanent that would define the rest of their lives. The coup was crushed within hours, the conspirators either dead or captured, and the palace secured, though the damage to the building and the casualty count among defenders was significant, a price paid for the years of resentment and manipulation that had festered beneath the surface of enforced order. Alara worked through the night and into the following day, healing the most seriously wounded and coordinating the other healers' efforts, pushing herself far past normal endurance. and it was only when the last critical patient had been stabilized that she finally allowed exhaustion to catch up with her. Swaying on her feet until strong arms caught her, Kieran having come to the healing ward as soon as his immediate kingly duties allowed, unable to stay away from her any longer. He carried her not to her own quarters but to his again, laying her on his bed, and this time making no apology for bringing her to his private space, both of them understanding that the time for pretending their connection was merely professional or platonic had passed, that something had changed between them, fundamentally during the trial and battle, a recognition that could no longer be denied or delayed. When Alara woke hours later, she found Kieran sitting in a chair beside the bed, watching her with an expression she had never seen before, open and vulnerable, and full of an emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. And when she whispered his name, he moved to kneel beside the bed, taking her hand in both of his much larger ones, and in a voice rough with feeling, he told her that he was done fighting what she made him feel, done trying to honor Celeste's memory by refusing to live, done pretending that Alara was merely a valued servant, rather than the female who had brought light back into his darkness, and given him a reason to remember who he had been before grief broke him. Like this video if you are as emotional as I am about Kieran finally confronting his feelings, and comment below about what you think will happen now that these two have finally acknowledged their bond. And please subscribe, so you can see how this incredible love story concludes. The confession hung in the air between them, Kieran's eyes searching Alara's face for any sign of her response, and she felt tears starting to spill over as she reached out to cup his face, telling him that she had fallen for him despite every logical reason she should not have, despite the social chasm between Alpha King and rejected Omega, despite knowing he might never be able to move past his grief. She had fallen. Anyway, because she saw beneath the ruthless reputation to the male who cared so deeply he had nearly destroyed himself, trying to keep everyone safe through strength alone. She told him about her visions of Celeste, about experiencing his first mate's death and final thoughts, and she shared what she had sensed in those last moments, that Celeste's greatest sorrow had been knowing her death would break him, that the Luna had loved him enough to want him to heal and live and find happiness again, rather than becoming a frozen monument to her memory. Kieran listened to this with visible emotion, tears tracking down his face as he finally allowed himself to truly grieve, rather than transforming pain into cold authority. And he asked Alara if she thought Celeste would forgive him for moving on, for finding connection with someone else. And Alara smiled through her own tears and assured him that from everything she had sensed of his first mate's character, Celeste would be furious if he wasted his life in perpetual mourning rather than honoring her memory by continuing the work of building a better kingdom and allowing himself to be happy again. The weight of permission, even second-hand permission from beyond death, visibly lifted from Kieran's shoulders, and he admitted that the bond he felt with Alara had the resonance of true mates, that his wolf had recognized her as his destined partner from the moment she healed him on that battlefield, and he had been fighting against that recognition, because accepting it felt like betrayal, until he finally understood that he could honor his past with Celeste while still building a future with Alara, that love was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but something that could grow and expand to encompass new bonds without diminishing what had come before. Alara confessed her own revelation, that she was descended from lunar healers, and her abilities were the hereditary gift of that ancient bloodline, and she watched Kieran's expression shift to wonder as he processed the implications, understanding finally why her healing was so powerful, why she could see visions and truth, why she represented something rare and precious that had been thought lost to history. He asked if she knew what being a lunar healer meant for their potential bond, and Alara admitted that according to Elder Fenwick, lunar healers were said to form particularly intense connections with their true mates, that the healing and psychic abilities extended to their partners, creating a partnership that was balanced and profound, two halves of a whole that enhanced each other, rather than one dominating the other. Kieran's smile at this information was genuine and warm, the kind of expression Alara suspected he had not worn in years, and he stated with conviction that a partnership of equals was exactly what he needed, that he had spent too long trying to bear the weight of the kingdom alone, and perhaps the moon goddess had sent him a mate, who could not only share that burden, but help him transform it into something better than mere survival and enforced order. He asked formally if she would accept him as her mate, if she would bond with him and become his Luna, helping him rebuild the kingdom along the lines of justice and compassion that Celeste had dreamed of and that Alara embodied in everything she did. And Alara answered without hesitation, yes, 1,000 times yes. She would bond with him and face whatever challenges came, together rather than separately, because she had learned on that first battlefield that her purpose was not just to heal bodies, but to heal hearts and societies, and she could think of no better way to fulfill that purpose than as partner to an Alpha King who was finally ready to lead with strength, tempered by wisdom and authority, balanced by genuine care for all his subjects. The bonding ceremony took place a month later, time having been needed to stabilize the kingdom after the conspiracies, exposure, and the attempted coup, to implement the first stages of reform that both Kirin and Alara agreed were necessary to prevent future resentment and manipulation, and to allow both of them to process the rapid changes in their relationship and their roles. The ceremony itself was revolutionary in its inclusiveness, Kirin having decreed that every wolf in the kingdom, regardless of rank or pack affiliation, was invited to attend or watch through the magical viewing spheres that were set up in every major settlement, making this a truly national celebration rather than an exclusive noble event. The venue was not the palace throne room, but the field where they had first met, where Alara had walked through carnage to heal the fallen, and Kirin had knelt before her in gratitude and recognition, and that blood-soaked battlefield had been transformed in the intervening months into a memorial garden, flowers and trees growing where violence had once reigned, creating a space of beauty and peace that honored all who had fallen, while symbolizing the kingdom's commitment to choosing growth over endless conflict. Alara wore not the elaborate gown and heavy crown of traditional Luna ceremonies, but a simpler dress of silver silk that reflected her healing light, her hair crowned not with gold and jewels, but with a circlet woven from moonflowers and silver leaves, the traditional crown of lunar healers that Elder Fenwick had helped her craft, claiming her heritage openly, rather than hiding it as generations of her ancestors had been forced to do. Kirin wore his formal armor, but had it modified to include symbols of healing and growth, alongside the traditional emblems of strength and authority, a public statement that his reign was transforming into something different from the brutal efficiency that had characterized the past 5 years. The ceremony itself was beautiful and surprisingly intimate despite the thousands in attendance, the traditional vows modified to emphasize partnership and mutual support rather than the hierarchical structure of typical Alpha and Luna bonding, and when the moon goddess's blessing descended upon them, visible as silver and gold light intertwining around their joined hands, every wolf present felt the rightness of this union, the sense that their king had finally found the partner he needed to fulfill his potential as a leader. The bonding bite, exchanged publicly as tradition required, created a connection between them that was immediately obvious, their expressions shifting in synchronization as the mate bond snapped fully into place, linking their wolves and their hearts in a permanent joining that would last the rest of their lives. And Kirin's face as he pulled back from the bite showed wonder and joy, and a kind of peace that many older wolves said they had not seen since before Celeste's death, suggesting that their king was finally healing from the wounds that had defined him for so long. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, a festival of music and food and storytelling that spread through every settlement in the kingdom, nobles and commoners mingling more freely than ever before, as social barriers began to soften under the new Luna's influence and the reforms that Kirin had already begun implementing in consultation with representatives from all levels of wolf society, rather than just the traditional noble advisors. The months following the bonding saw massive changes, rippling through the kingdom, some controversial but all carefully considered and implemented with input from diverse voices, rather than imposed by royal decree alone. Alara established healing academies in multiple locations, training healers from all backgrounds and economic classes, breaking the monopoly that noble families had traditionally held on medical knowledge, and creating a new generation of healers who saw their calling as service to all rather than maintaining social hierarchy. Kirin restructured the government to include a representative council, with members elected from different regions and social classes, giving voice to wolves who had previously been excluded from power, while still maintaining enough central authority to prevent the fracturing that had plagued the kingdom before his unification. Together they traveled throughout the realm, meeting with pacts and settlements, listening to concerns and grievances, making it clear that the royal couple was not distant authority but accessible leadership that genuinely cared about the well-being of every subject. The changes were not without resistance, some nobles clinging desperately to their traditional privileges and complaining that standards were being lowered and hierarchy destroyed. But the majority of wolves, particularly those from lower ranks, supported the reforms enthusiastically, finally feeling that they had value and voice in the kingdom they called home. Kieran and Alara faced each challenge together, their mate bond allowing them to support each other through difficult decisions and political complications, and those who watched them could see that theirs was truly a partnership. Neither dominant nor submissive, but balanced and mutually strengthening in ways that made them more effective together than either could have been alone. 2 years after their bonding, the kingdom had transformed almost beyond recognition. Prosperity and stability achieved not through fear and brutal authority, but through justice and genuine investment in all levels of society, and the Alpha King who had once been called the Ruthless was now known as Kieran the Just, a title he wore with more pride than he had ever felt in his previous reputation. Alara had become beloved throughout the realm, her healing abilities and tireless work for the marginalized, making her a symbol of compassion and hope, and the revelation of her lunar healer heritage had transformed public perception of that ancient bloodline from dangerous anomaly to blessed gift, with several other wolves who possessed lesser healing abilities coming forward to claim their own connection to that nearly extinct lineage. The palace itself had changed, becoming more open and accessible, with regular public audiences where any wolf could bring concerns directly to their rulers, and the healing ward that Alara had established had grown into a major medical center that trained and supported healers serving throughout the kingdom. The memorial garden where Kieran and Alara had bonded had become a pilgrimage site, wolves traveling from distant territories to walk the paths where a battlefield had been transformed into beauty, seeing in that transformation a reflection of their kingdom's own journey from violence to peace, from rigid hierarchy to inclusive justice. On a cool autumn evening, Kieran and Alara stood in that garden, her head resting against his chest as his arms wrapped around her. Both of them, looking out over the flowers and remembering that first day when she had walked through carnage to heal strangers, and he had knelt before her in recognition of something his conscious mind had not yet understood, but his wolf had known immediately was precious beyond measure. Alara was pregnant with their second child, their daughter Luna Aurora, sleeping peacefully in the palace nursery, already showing signs of inheriting both her father's alpha strength and her mother's healing gifts in a combination that would make her formidable in ways neither parent could quite predict. And they talked quietly about their hopes for the children they were raising, for a generation that would grow up in a kingdom where worth was measured by character rather than birth rank, where healing was valued as highly as strength, where leadership meant service rather than domination. Kieran admitted that he sometimes still struggled with the cold, ruthless instincts that years of grief had ingrained in him, that he occasionally had to consciously choose compassion over efficiency, justice over expediency, but that Alara's presence and example made those choices easier, reminding him constantly why the harder path of genuine care was worth walking, even when fear and brutality would be simpler. Alara shared her own ongoing challenges, the exhaustion of using her healing abilities so extensively, the political complications of being a reformed Omega who now wielded significant power, the occasional doubts about whether she was truly qualified for the responsibilities she had accepted, but she also acknowledged that partnership with Kieran gave her strength she had never possessed alone, that his support and belief in her made impossible things feel achievable. They stood together in comfortable silence, two broken souls who had found each other in the chaos of battle, and had chosen repeatedly to heal and grow together, rather than allowing their wounds to define them, and their kingdom was better for their union, transformed by leaders who led not from cold distance, but from authentic care, forged through shared suffering and hard-won wisdom. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the flowers around them, and Kieran turned Alara in his arms, lifting her chin so their eyes met, and he told her with quiet intensity that she had saved him that day on the battlefield, not just from physical death, but from the spiritual death of becoming a monster wearing a crown, that her courage to stay when others fled, to heal when violence would have been easier, had shown him a different kind of strength than he had known existed, and that every day since he had been grateful to the moon goddess for sending him a mate who challenged him to be better than his grief, and anger would have let him become. Elara smiled and replied that he had saved her too, given her purpose and belonging after years of rejection and wandering, proven that her gifts were valuable rather than frightening, shown her that love did not have to be earned through perfection, but could be freely given and gratefully received, and that she looked forward to spending the rest of their lives building something beautiful together, healing their kingdom one heart at a time, while raising children who would never know the pain of being told they were worthless because of circumstances beyond their control. Kieran kissed her then, gentle and deep, a promise and a celebration, and the last rays of sunset caught them in a halo of gold and silver light that seemed to bless their union and the kingdom they had transformed through determination and love. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey of Elara and Kieran, from that first battlefield where everything changed to the beautiful life they built together. If you enjoyed this story of love and redemption, please give this video a like and let me know in the comments which moment touched your heart the most, and make sure you are subscribed with notifications on, because I have so many more supernatural romance stories coming that will captivate your heart and imagination, just like this one did. Until next time, may your own heart find the healing and love it deserves.